James Lipton's Inside, Chapter 6, page 133. Granted, not a lot had happened here in Mycenae in the 3,200 years since Agamemnon climbed those steps I'd climbed today. Certainly nothing is interesting. Maybe these shepherds had a right. Maybe I had a right. But still, it felt peculiar. The shepherds joined in, insisting vociferously that all that talk about revenge for what Agamemnon had done to Iphigenia at Alice was just cover-up for Clytemnestra and Agathias's real motive, to get Agamemnon out of the way permanently so they could continue the adulterous affair. The shepherds sat back, resting their case, waiting for me to yield and stop perpetrating the nonsense that had fogged the air of this case for 3 millennia. I guess they figured that if they could make one convert, their day had been well spent, and I wondered how many times they'd lain in wait here for the next candidate to emerge from La Belle Hélène. When the dinner bell sounded at the hotel, and I rose to return to the worst accommodation in Europe, one of the shepherds reached out and handed me his crook, perhaps because I'd been such a malleable initiate. The crook hangs prominently in my study to this day, the carved dragon coiled on its crest, reminding me every time I glance at it of a magical evening when a circle of generous shepherds shared with me the whole unvarnished truth of Homer's odes and the plays of Aeschylus and Euripides. When there was no longer any gainsaying the reality of Athens, the wheel of fire folded its tripods and C-stands, and I returned the car to the producer who, in a fit of rage at the film's fate, shoved it off the pier as it was being loaded on the freighter that would have returned it to the States. I dare say the Greeks hauled the wreck out, but since it carried me to some of the most provocative experiences of my life, I'd like to think that it still rests in the azure waters of the Aegean, a memorial to a remarkable time and place and a seminal adventure. I returned, on my own now, to Paris, and spent the better part of the rest of that year there, undergoing the rites of passage that Paris uniquely affords, falling happily in with the community of American literary expatriates who were studiously following in the footsteps of Hemingway, F. Scott Fitzgerald, and Gertrude Stein. A number of us met weekly at a salon we'd set up in the living room of one of the better-heeled, hence better housed, of the group. It was customary on these Sunday afternoons for everyone in the circle to exhibit the week's work. Poets read poems, novelists read the latest chapter, composers premiered sonatas, singers performed Puccini. On one occasion, a stout young woman who'd come to Paris to study opera declined to sing when her turn came. Sacrilege! No one had ever refused to join in the sacred ritual. Thinking she wanted to be coaxed, a chorus of persuasion arose, but she was adamant. So was the group, until finally, red-faced, she blurted out, "If you must know, I'm wearing a new girdle, and it's so tight I can't sing." She spoke in French, in which the word for girdle is gain. The room went silent, and finally one of the writers in the corner drawled, "Well, your gain is our loss." As with any masterful pun, respect demanded silence, not laughter. The room was in such awe that no one was willing to follow the jeu de mots, and the afternoon ended on that stirring note. Since I was no longer on an expense account, the question of keeping body and soul together came up, and as it had so often in my life, from the photo engraving plant to the Detroit Times to the Lone Ranger, I'd shown some agility, but here in Paris a work permit was virtually impossible to acquire. There was at that time barely enough work for the French. Rescue came, as it so often did in my life, from an unexpected quarter. On first arriving in Paris, I'd met a young Frenchman who had introduced me to all the blandishments of Paris. My age, he was an experienced and invaluable, if unorthodox, guide. In the course of one evening's prowl, we found ourselves, at his suggestion and with my enthusiastic agreement, in the red light district, Paris's famed Rue Pigalle, where we were besieged on a cold March night by a clutch of clientless pools competing to offer the most exotic delights. My friend Fernand was an experienced hand. When 2 of the filles offered to demonstrate their love for each other, Fernand struck a bargain, and the 4 of us repaired for the demonstration to a room in the hotel that housed them and their colleagues. I'll ascribe to myself neither concupiscence nor consternation. Suffice to say, to my then untutored eye the performance was matchless. When they concluded, they offered additional services, which I declined on the grounds, to which I still subscribe, that if you have to pay for a partner for sex, you don't deserve it. Thoughtful, artful seduction, I reasoned then and believe now, is the price one partner pays for the privilege of the other. When Ferdinand and I came down the hotel stairway, he grabbed my arm suddenly and steered me toward a curtained opening. Pushing through it, we arrived in a bar, to a chorus of protests from the fees and their mechs, a less pejorative term than pimps, vide Irma la douche, for whom it served as a private club in which to drink calvados, munch on artichokes, gossip about their kinkier clients, play bezique, a card game from which Pinnacle descends, and enjoy some hard-earned R&R. The walls had been painted by the artists of neighboring Montmartre, in return for a cost-free affection, I suspect, with a remarkably convincing station de metro. At one end of the room, a trompe-l'oeil subway train rushed at us from the dark depths of a tunnel. Civilians were strictly barred from the station, but Ferdinand's rough Parisian argot and attitude gained us enough time to slide into a booth, from which we refused to move. The result was a standoff. We were ignored, and repeated requests for service went unanswered, until the two fees Ferdinand had recently employed, who had been dressing upstairs, walked in and elected to join us in our booth. That brought the patron, a burly man who spoke impenetrable French of Avon region, to our table, where he took orders for us and our newfound friends. Their names, we discovered, were Regine and Mickey. Regine, who sat next to me, was blonde and young, with the kind of fresh beauty that adorned the beaches of the Riviera. She was, in fact, Canois, and had come into the milieu in order to earn enough money to return to Cannes and open a perfume shop. It turned out that she, like many of her colleagues, was very frugal, living simply and banking every sou against the day she would be able to realize her dream. In time I discovered that she allowed herself one financial indiscretion a year, leaving the Pigalle district for the Avenue Montaigne and its renowned houses of couture to buy a designer dress for a single occasion, church on Easter Sunday. Out of respect for the church and an authentic religious conviction, Regine eschewed church every other day of the year, convinced that her presence would be hypocritical as long as she remained in the milieu. But Easter was sacred, and she dressed appropriately and beautifully. I saw her collection of dresses. Once I'd been admitted to the inner sanctum of the putative hotel on Rue Pigalle. I returned to the bar nearly every evening toward midnight for supper with my friend. It was an unusual relationship. She was sexually available, of course, for a price, but not to me because the thought of buying her now revolted us both. On the other hand, availing myself free of charge of her professional services felt to me like cynical backhanded exploitation, and would have raised God knows what questions for her at the end of her long day's work, or worse, between clients. I learned that what these professional temptresses offered was, for them, anything but sexual, no matter how their clients persuaded themselves.